He modified them later, though, didn't he?
Yes.
I mean, there seems to be a kind of evolution, where he starts from a more or less static classical form and moves towards a form more dependent on contingencies such as sunlight and things like that.
Right.
But always there are these two opposite pressures, as it were, the eternal and the contingent. I mean, maybe today we're more able to accept the idea of the monument than was possible in the days when he was actually designing them. But it's still an interesting point, actually, what place the monument plays in our total conception of architecture today.
But they were situated very monument.
Yes. Well, we'll be hearing about Chandigarh later, but I mean, we won't be hearing about the Capitol buildings. And they're the sort of apotheosis of Corb's idea of monumental architecture related to the geography of the landscape.
Yeah. Could I just ask a broader-based question? You commented that it was impossible to separate his form from the content, the aesthetic from the ideal. And I wondered if you could sort of just comment on that in light of Buddha's attitude to Pesach and his analysis of it, where he definitely tries to separate exactly that.
Buddha.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't read Rodin's book, frankly, but I understand that Corbusier himself made a characteristically obscure remark, to the effect that the people were right and the architect was wrong. Right.
Yes.
But in what sense did Rodin try to separate the idea of the architecture from the idea of the
well, he does. He talks about the structure in a very sort of Habrackian way, about it acting as a support structure rather than
I see what you mean.
Dictator of social conditions.
Yes, in fact, going right back to the original domino idea.
But I mean, there you've got a separation of sort of experiential architecture and architectural theory, which is in its actual built form very, very far away from the theory, and it provides sufficient flexibility for it to be translated in a variety of social manoeuvres.
Yes, the trouble with that action of splitting the atom, which is involved there, is that it either does one of two things. It either reduces the frame to a mathematical and a non-architectural status, and it then involves what has traditionally been associated with architecture with privatization, with the idea of what has traditionally been associated with the private person furnishing his room. So in fact it blows the concept of architecture apart completely.
Well, surely it only blows it apart as your definition of monumentalism.
Incidentally, when I talked about modern architecture, I wasn't talking about housing, because I would the very idea of monumental architecture is that you accept a typology of architecture. Right?
Yes.
So some kinds of architecture which are not monumental. However, insofar as housing might be considered architecture, I don't know whether it would be considered monumental architecture, I thought not. But if it's considered to be architecture, it's something of a Habrackian idea. Well, you see, I mean, it depends on the instantaneousness of the possibilities. If the person actually can build his own house with materials at hand, then this could be a spontaneous expression of what he liked. But what that person liked would also be a social thing. It wouldn't be a private thing. It would be something that he'd learned to like from his relation to society. So what is the relationship between these separate individual, instantaneous, spontaneous expressions of what a house is? Ultimately, it comes back to something which is not individual. It comes back to something that has some relation to man in society. Because we're dealing with something something is being repeated. Even if superficially the forms may look different, something is being repeated. And not only the frame is being repeated, but certain standard elements are being repeated. So it leaves the problem of what is the relation to the individual society, which is at the back, in my opinion, of the relation of architecture as an art to society.
You know, choosing Pesach introduces a funny aspect to the thing, because Pesach, probably more than any other housing projected by Corb is one which is very tentative, I think. And I always think that the layout of Pessac, compared to housing before and housing afterwards, is kind of strangely tentative. And it's tentative, I think, which does have some bearing on some of the things being touched on in this discussion, because it's tentative about the representation of the collective larger than the family unit. If you look at early housing projects towards new architecture, which I think predates Pessac certainly, the use of the domino element is played with in such a way as to group the house into a larger entity that would be recognizable typically as something greater than the individual house. That gesture is relatively speaking absent from Pessac. And I realized that by introducing this aspect, one's kind of almost invoking a Pessac that doesn't exist. But I think some of the problems that you're referring to are really, that are now being discussed between you and Alan lie there somewhere or other, because it seems to me that one of his preoccupations vis-a-vis housing was the representation of some unit larger than the individual house, and the question of what form that should take. But usually no doubt about the imperative to make that gesture, which I personally think he inherits again from the French utopian socialist tradition, and other people have pointed to that also. Somewhere or other, I think Fourier actually talks about how the petty bourgeois can escape the miserable individual dwelling and live like Louis XIV in a palace, in a style befitting to a man as opposed to some in his opinion, subhuman way of life. And I think Corbusier is but it's not very evident in Pessac, actually, strangely.
Stan?
I find it very significant that it is not evident in Pessac, because I think what part of this discussion is about is the sort of the cultural mediation of social philosophy. And I think that Corb's cultural mediation of social philosophy, apart from being extremely varied, I mean, he can take a stand in favor of one cultural idea like the collective house in the form of a factory in the case of the Salvation Army headquarters. And then he can take the other view, which I think he takes in much of what he writes on the Ville Radieuse, of a society that is cosmopolitan and that is that offers the individual family unit that possibility to live, okay, serviced by a kind of a hotel type management with a lot of servants, with a crew of servants, but at the same time a cosmopolitan situation of isolation in the metropolis. You do not need to live in community. And I think this idea is always struggling against the other, the community, the religious, quote-unquote, and I would like to say something concerning religion in a moment, the community, medieval, village ideal that is so important in Germany with Bruno Taut and Ernst Mayr and others, and then the cosmopolitan idea of the upper middle class white collar worker who lives nowhere, who is a nomad basically, and who has a little apartment that is plugged into a sort of a hotel situation, but that is he's not part of a community. I think the Germans are likely to fall into a very romantic 19th century trap of dreaming of life in a city as under the sign of the village, as a community where you have a definite role to assume. And Corb goes beyond that. Actually, he criticizes that in some of his projects, including Pessac, in that he says, by implication, this is not what I really want. I mean, then he falls back onto a more sort of communitarian, unifying concept in the unité d'habitation. May I make another little remark?
Please.
I find one difficulty that I have with Corbusier and also with discussing Corbusier, and I think Alan's paper has helped me to see that clearer, is that we tend, when we speak of certain, and I tend, and that was probably very misleading in some of the things I said before in the context of the Salvation Army, to attach too much weight to terms like Christian or socialist or collectivist in the context of cultural ideas, because the phenomenon that is so striking or obvious in Corb is that, okay, there is a thing like the Stadtkrone, there's a thing like the Christian medieval idea of the cathedral or the temple that unifies a large phenomenon such as the city. Okay, that comes from that may be called religion, but it might as well be called cultural history or history of society. Especially of pre-industrial forms of society. So, I mean, the term religion should be used with quote unquote. Now, concerning collectivism and communal housing, that has, of course, a Marxist or proletarian overtones. But these two should sort of be handled very carefully, because what you rightly pointed at is it is so obvious that much of the culture, and especially the avant-garde culture in socialist Soviet Union in the 20s, was much more Fourierist or Rousseauist than anything else, than Marxist. And I don't think that that it's possible to say on the other side that there are Marxian elements in the bourgeois culture of the West, but at least there are anti-utopian elements, very strong anti-utopian elements in bourgeois culture, that perhaps are very relevant in a Marxian perspective. So I find one of the difficulties, don't you think so?
Also its prophecies.
Yes. So I think the problem we face, or we have at times in a discussion of Corb, and particularly in a discussion of the social or the societal content of his buildings as concepts or ideas as representational phenomena, is that we should be much more careful than I have been, my short and sharp presentation, with terms like bourgeois, Marxist, and collectivist, and so on, because they really do not coincide they do not coincide on the whole with political positions in history, for instance.
Right. Well, I think I'll have to stop it there. And thank you very much, Alan. Now we have a chance to go on to this question of religion, at least in one sense. Russel Walden is going to be talking on Ronchamp. I've given him the title Ronchamp Reconsidered. I don't know if he's going to reconsider it. Russel, as you will soon hear, is from New Zealand. He teaches at Birmingham, and he's putting together this book called The Open Hand. It's a series of 15 essays on Le Corbusier to come out, I think, in about 6 or 8 months, published by MIT Press. That's an advertisement. A lot of the people here today have published something in it.
Thank you, Charles. It's good to follow Alan Cahoon because many of the ideas he's picked up, I want to pick up in a specialist example at Le Corbusier at Ronchamp. I've chose to talk about Ronchamp this afternoon because many people have talked about the 20s, and I've worked in the 20s, and it's a change to get away from talking about the 20s. When I tap on the, you can, yes, we can start. Right. Le Corbusier at Ronchamp. The architecture of Le Corbusier seems, can we have the lights off? Seems to possess mysterious, elusive, even ineffable qualities. While we can usually describe the essential nature of other architects' work, Le Corbusier's designs elicit from us stronger and less objective reactions difficult to articulate. This is reflected in the extremely emotional responses which his work has always roused, and in the fact that any one of his designs can produce such varying reactions. For example, Stan von Voos, in writing about Ronchamp, reminds us about the influence of nature upon Le Corbusier. And the current chaplain, Paul Radar, ventures the explanation that Ronchamp is a creative inspiration which cannot be understood by the clinically minded. Vincent Scully has explained Ronchamp in terms of the sculptural quality of Greek sculpture. And Jim Sterling thought Ronchamp to be irrational. Well, certainly Mumford and Pesner, though they were not quite so quick on the draw as Stirling, eventually agreed that Ronchamp did not appeal to the intellect. Now, André Wogenscky, Corb's chief assistant, who worked with him for 20 years, recently said to me that Ronchamp was the beginning of the decline in Corbusier's work. And Martin Purdy has written in The Open Hand that Ronchamp doesn't seem to seek its essence in the theological program. Now, I'm not here today to argue the pros and cons of any of these interpretations. As for me, Ronchamp is a personal expression, a paradox between the Christian and deist points of view, a paradox between Christian ideas about pilgrimage on one hand and the values of a nature worshipper on the other. Speculatively, the problem which faced Le Corbusier seems to have been to express these two schools of thought. As obviously there is a tension between the two sets of values. Yet perhaps the richness of expression at Ronchamp is due entirely to this tension, as it appears to have sharpened Le Corbusier's creative dilemma. I stress this point because the problem before me now is how to explain the level of consciousness, the multiplicity of intentions, the multiplicity of hidden meanings brought and fused together in the design of this pilgrimage chapel above the village of Ronchamp. Now, to offer any explanation, one must humbly set out to discover the meanings inherent to the design. This brings me hard up against the problem that the multiplicity of the design is just not in the eyes of the critics I have mentioned. As fundamental to Ronchamp, deeply embedded in its theoretical foundation, is the multiplicity itself of Corbusier's approach to design. To develop this more fully, we need to consider just how Le Corbusier went about designing. Fortunately, he put a few ideas down on this point, and in one of his unpublished sketchbooks, he wrote, "When a task is assigned me, I usually put it aside in my memory, which means not to allow myself any sketch for months. The human head is so formed so as to possess a certain independence. There is an area where the elements of a problem can be left to work themselves out. They are left to waver, to simmer, to ferment. Then when one day, with spontaneous subconscious initiative, the inspiration comes. You take a pencil, a carbon, some coloured pencils, and you let it flow out onto the paper. The idea comes as the child comes. It is brought into the world. It is born." From this insight into Corbusier's creative process, we can see that it is possible that his intellectual invention could have been set alight by anything that takes his fancy, from the writings of philosophers to, say, the form and structure of a shell or a flower. From this point of view, his design thinking could be described as a symphony of language, a language which contains many levels of meanings. These meanings are open to all of us if we could but see and appreciate them. Yet, to see them, to appreciate them, we have to discover them. And if we consider this paradox I began with, the tension between Christian ideals and deist values, and place this paradox within the horizon of Corb's approach to design, we are inevitably brought to the conclusion that Corb's thinking is dualistic. It is dualistic in the sense that he based his creativity upon resolving opposing principles, on dichotomies which continually play against one another and which are expressed at various points in his heartfelt architecture. Perhaps if Le Corbusier was sitting amongst you now, he'd probably not concede this point, because he'd probably say that as a designer, he refuses to accept dichotomies, to which we need to ask why. And he would probably reply, as an artist, he sought to resolve all difficulties in his mind in his search for an expressive unity. To recall his design process, his mind stored the contradictions and dimensions of the problem where they were left to waver, to simmer, to ferment, until his intentions had been formulated. In this sense, the contradictions from Corb's point of view are resolved. To put it another way, Corbusier took these contradictions to a point where they were no longer opposed, but began to become convergent, where a unity is formed and realised. To illustrate this point at the physical level, there are contrasts of specific architectural qualities, as in the play of geometric and amorphous forms, which are clearly in evidence at Ronchamp. Of course, this formal development began long before Ronchamp. Such a process was quite clearly underway when Jean did the living room space of the Schwab House of 1916. And when he moved from Chaux de Fonds to Paris, such a process took an even more stronger synthesis as expressed in the Raoul Laroche's Hall and Painting Gallery at Auteuil. By the time this space had been built in March 1922, Jean had not only taken on the new identity of Le Corbusier, in his own opinion, the architectural revolution was over. Thus, early in 1950, when he had committed himself to do this chapel on the high spot at Ronchamp, his formal dexterity and development had become so developed and controlled that Le Corbusier spoke about it as a game. Turn this picture upside down, he said, and discover the game. Well, this is all very interesting, but I'm not at all sure in my mind how relevant it all is when the program has to do with Christian pilgrimage. This is a point which I'll pick up again in this paper, but the mystery does not stop, however, at the physical level. As at the theoretical level in his writings, Corb continually describes the world in terms of paired opposites, such as head and heart, matter and spirit, active and passive forces, reason and emotion, objective and subjective. These were the poles of his creativity. Moreover, these dualistic ideals in thought and design were carried also within Corbusier's personality, as Charles Jencks has often pointed out. There is no escaping the notion that Corbusier was a highly emotional man. This was expressed wholesomely towards the ladies, as well as providing the charge behind his work. It is not surprising, then, that he saw the whole practice of architecture in terms of a struggle, as a battle between opposing forces. Even at the RIBA, he seems to have spent most of the evening of his gold medal address referring to himself as a cab horse that had taken the whip for 40 years. With such a complex emotional personality, it is not surprising, then, to find him relating to Cervantes' hero, Don Quixote. Each evening, before he went to sleep, he read a short passage to relieve his mental struggle. And in this matter, Corb was just like any other architect with responsibility, as those who have built anything in Britain in the last 10 years have all had a lion's share of whipping. Perhaps Corb's attitude to stress was expressed perhaps more openly than many. Yet from the time of his many legal battles of his early years, he seems to have done very little job running. At Ronchamp, Corb's assistant, André Wogenscky, built Ronchamp. The fact of the matter is, Corb wasn't a builder, but as Max Fry said, his jobs got built nevertheless. Considering the recurrent example of dualism and paradox in Corb's architecture, let us consider for the moment the open hand. This was a key idea in the design mythology which Corb evolved through struggles to express the idea of giving and receiving, a dualistic image, disembodied and isolated from the earth. It is more than just a hand. It is also a bird, an age-old symbol of the spiritual as opposed to the material world. Perhaps Corb's notion of the spiritual wasn't the traditional Christian point of view, as no doubt he thought spirituality belonged outside religious institutions, which partly explains his lifelong preoccupation with the divinity of nature. With these thoughts in mind, if we consider the question of the ideas behind Ronchamp, it seems to be a remarkable oversight on part of practically everybody who's written about Ronchamp, either to leave the doors out altogether or just pass them off obliquely as Corb's private mutterings. Sterling, for example, thought them rather amateurish and superfluous. Now, historically, doors and doorways to religious spaces do more than merely mark the entry and exit. For example, the sculpture around the portal of Chartres is not just there to hang a coat on. The sculpture is essentially symbolic. In the same way, the enamelled doors of Ronchamp offer similar clues to those who set out to discover what Corbusier was trying to express at Ronchamp. The key idea is pilgrimage. Though the concept of pilgrimage on this site is not totally Christian, as the original temple was dedicated to sun worship. In these doors, I think Corb was trying to express the alliance of man with his notion of spirituality. Quite clearly, Corb, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, was making a sociological comment upon the dilemma of contemporary man. Man's loss of spirituality, demythologized by a materialistic seeking world without a sense of direction, is the essence of the comment. Starting on the left, Corb's processional doorway starts with the idea of pilgrimage through life as identified by the symbol of the pathway. It twists and turns, moving to and fro, seemingly a sea of fog, as it advances from out of the darkness towards the light. Along this journey, the individual makes his personal encounter through work, as symbolized by the cogwheels in the center of the panels. On either side of the work symbol, we have the giving and receiving hands, reinforced by the pyramid of man and the star of the spirit. All these ideas point towards a higher consciousness in the red and blue clouds, iconic gestures of the spiritual reality, which we find above. Through all these ideas, we get a fusion of Christian myths and deist symbols in nature. For Corb, man made his spiritual encounter in nature and in his life's work. And it was in these human experiences that he perceived life's secrets through giving and receiving. These symbols, therefore, are all dualistic extensions of Corb's attempt to fuse Christian ideals within the earth reality of the deist world. It seems that within this classicized framework, Corb is trying to point to the value side of human existence, towards a sense of the sacred. On the reverse side of these processional doors, we find a similar desire to express the intensity of the spiritual encounter. This time, it is conveyed by a spiraling symbol rising from out of the darkness to the light above, from red through gold in forgiving hands, a gesture of forgiveness. Below these hands, we have the deist symbols of the sun and the birds of the spirit. In all this, Corb seems to be pointing towards an idea of the spiritual, as he had come to understand it. Although the whole composition adopts the Christian symbol of suffering, there is no doubt in my mind that the struggle towards reaching a synthesis is conducted outside the boundaries of Christian orthodoxy. My point being that this is yet another example of Corb's creative dilemma or paradox. Now, perhaps I haven't done justice in my interpretation to what Corbusier was trying to express, but I haven't left the doors out, nor could I assert, as Sterling did, that the sensational impact of the chapel on the visitor is significantly not sustained for any great length of time, as when the emotion subsides, there is little to appeal to the intellect. Agreed, Sterling wrote this 9 months after the chapel was finished in July 55. Now, Sterling, as you all know, is an outstanding architect in the image of Corbusier, and it would be interesting to know whether he still thinks this way. Perhaps Siegfried Gideon's plea, made in the last edition of Space, Time and Architecture, that we need historical perspective in order to make a final assessment of Le Corbusier's work, allows no hostages to fortune. Of the interior of the chapel, Gideon reminds us of the interconnection between inner and outer space that Le Corbusier calls acoustic space. And yet, from other theological points of view, the interior reveals the paradox of Corb's creative dilemma. If, for the pilgrim, the sanctuary is the heart of the Christian mystery, because it is here the feast of the liturgy is celebrated and enjoyed, then the spatial resolution of altar, cross, and intercessionary virgin should reflect this theological understanding. Quite clearly, Le Corbusier has had great difficulty in resolving these elements. In point of fact, it took Le Corbusier 2 years to reach the resolution before you after the chapel had been in use. From this point of view, the sanctuary at La Tourette is a good deal more convincing than at Ronchamp. Yet scientifically speaking, Ronchamp acoustically is more than a great deal better than La Tourette. Though such a failure absorbed Le Corbusier for a time, in that he considered using acoustic baffles on the walls, because these forms would upset the visual silence of the space, they were dropped. Now, if we remember the fact that La Tourette was originally designed for a preaching order, then I ask you all to remember my thesis I put before you at the outset. Is it not true that visual considerations have taken precedence over theological and acoustical problems and function? And is it not true that these predicaments confirm, rather than refute my thesis, that Corbusier was caught in a deist dilemma? For me, these problems clearly expose his creative paradox. Now, to develop this point further, can we consider another facet of the chapel, the plan? From the point of view of the long east wall, that's the one facing the sanctuary, this one here. From the point of view of the long east wall, connecting interior with exterior by virtue of a swivelling virgin placed, yes, I like the expression swivelling virgin, placed high on the wall. I think Corb would have enjoyed it as well, because he had a great eye for the ladies. Anyway, that's a side issue. From a point of view of let's pick up the point again. From the point of view of the long east wall connecting interior with exterior by virtue of a swivelling virgin, the plan is quite brilliant, as it accommodates interior and exterior places for the action of an individual and mass celebrations of the liturgy. This trapezoid plan was picked up by many church architects who followed in Corb's footsteps, but considered as a volume to the feast of the liturgy, it is perhaps less convincing. Again, I would contend, because Corb was so busy echoing the four horizons in the form of the shell roof and of the south wall, he seems to have lost the drama of the Christian feast in the favour of the drama of nature. This criticism belongs largely to the interior, as quite clearly, when the pilgrims gather in August and September for the mass celebrations of the feast, Corb's backdrop of acoustic shells seems to work quite dramatically. If we look at this point now from intellectual direction, by examining what he wrote about the chapel, Corb's romanticism is clearly expressed by the words, "The key is light, light illuminates shapes, and shapes have emotional power." Again, we have the paradox confirmed by his writings. Now, perhaps, if the less visually gifted German architect Rudolf Schwarz were to paraphrase Corb's text, he would have said, almost certainly, the key is the mass illuminates the spiritual life, and the spiritual life has ultimate power. Now, if we compare both approaches from these verses, you can see why I assert that perhaps Corb's deist indulgences have led him into the theological shallows. Now, the client didn't ask for a nature temple. Was it any wonder that during the contract there was a rumpus with the Besançon diocese about authority, which was resolved by the church having authority in liturgical matters, while Le Corbusier retained control in artistic matters of design? That such an argument took place is in itself interesting, though perhaps it is a conflict modern architecture should not have been having as late as the mid-50s. I could perhaps carry this argument further into considering the side chapels and the spaces which link them. But to do so would, in the end, just confirm rather than detract from my thesis. Well now, has Corb overstepped the mark? Has he been slightly indulgent? Has Corb played his game perhaps once too often? Quite clearly, André Wogenscky had a point when he admitted that Corb's Ronchamp represented the beginning of the decline. Interesting, Corb wrote in his Œuvre Complète that it was agreeable for once to become absorbed in a problem without any real practical program. Yet for an architect as talented as a Corbusier, who pushed himself hard all his life, who led 3 generations of architects by the nose, can such notoriety justify the wholly personalised synthesis Corbusier has attempted on the hill above Ronchamp? Remember, the village of Ronchamp was only 3,500 strong. There was money from the War Damages Commission for the destruction of the last chapel on the site. The tourists could be fleeced. Yet Ronchamp costs more than 50,000, even after André Messonnier, Corb's job architect, had to reduce the original design to that shown here in the model. I do not want to stress the practical problems of building Corb's design, except to say that there were plenty of them, as there are in any job. What I'm trying to say, if we study Corbusier today, and I think we should, we have to do it with our eyes and minds open. This is not to say that I want to see Le Corbusier demythologized. Surely modern architecture would have been a very tame and dead affair without him. To my mind, his chief value today lies in the fact that in an age which completely lacks a language of architecture, Le Corbusier is the supreme example of an architect who could respond creatively to a problem. Even as an old man, he could express an idea so powerfully as in the exterior form that the architectural world in the 50s was stunned into admiration. The way the elements of the roof, walls and hooded light towers are put together is pure brilliance from the drawing board. Yet, for all this vitality, for all this sensuality of imagery, one cannot escape the conclusion that this building was designed outside in. If you look at the earlier sketches, Corb said the idea was unlocked by the 4 horizons. Those towards Ballon d'Assas and the plain of the Saône seem to have been particularly influential. In these directions, the site overlooks an immense landscape of sky and countryside. Such a commanding stimulus was not lost on Corbusier, whose creative response was individualistic and unique. If one searches the history of architecture for parallels, one has to go all the way back to the Romanesque period to find images of similar power and vitality. The Abbé du Tournai springs to mind as an example. Corb visited this monastery in July 53 before building of the chapel started in October 53. From the cloister, a composition in the vernacular of forms and light, you can see the parallel. In a way, you could say that Corb created a sequel to the mystery of Tournai, its profound peace and spiritual joy. However, Tournai is more theologically orientated than Ronchamp. Tournai did not influence the design of Ronchamp, but it certainly did for L'Arteret, which is certainly one reason why L'Arteret is perhaps a more profound work than Ronchamp. Yet Ronchamp still manages to excite the imagination of the young and old. Indeed, one could say that the chapel at Ronchamp is Le Corbusier's most popular building. It's on stamps, on posters. Why? Because it says something powerful. Emotion, remember, is not a foreign element in any religious experience. In this matter, one cannot deny that from the outside at least, Corb is in total command of his medium. It's aggressive, it's sensual, it's monumental. Bold, yes. Paradoxes, yes. Irrational, no. It seems to me Corb put a lifetime's experience into this building. The power of the imagery, deist or otherwise, expresses a great human hope for the salvation of contemporary man. In this respect, Corb seems to have set out to capture the ineffable, the inexpressible, which is nothing less than endeavouring to express the sacred. But, as Solzhenitsyn in his noble speech on literature warned, no artist is capable of creating an independent spiritual world, nor is man able to create a balanced spiritual system. And this brings me to my conclusion that the dilemma of Le Corbusier at Ronchamp is the dilemma of the deist who built a Christian chapel of pilgrimage which seeks to express the intangible, which seeks to express the sense of the sacred.
Thank you, Russell. I'm sure people want to know what a swiveling virgin is. One of the functions of Ronchamp was private intercessional prayer, and the Virgin was a statue recovered from the last chapel, which was bombed in 1944, and it was placed on the east wall. And Corb had this problem, resolving this paradox of individual prayer, of liturgical masses, both for small numbers of people and for large gatherings, which he called, which took place in August and September. Oh, I'm so thirsty. We'll get you some coffee.
Can I ask you again which chapter it was that you say he influenced Simon Chirès and
Well, Duthorne. It's in Provence. It's just off the motorway, about 20 k's off the motorway going towards Saint-Raphael. I exhort you all to go there, because if ever an architect succeeded in a piece of architecture, he succeeded at Tournai. And the roots of Corbusier, you feel him at every step.
There's a book written called The Architecture of Truth, and it's about Le Tournai, and Corbusier has a page introduction to that, saying what a nice...
Yes, I'm trying to get hold of that book.
Upstairs in the library.
Is it 1957? Yes, I have one of the difficulties of coming from the provinces, I can never find anything.
Any other questions? Right. Thank you very much.
Good.
Well, now we move back a little bit in time. Actually, we're not keeping much to chronology, nor the clock. And we'll have two final contributions. One from Ken Frampton and one from Madhu Saran. Ken Frampton, as you probably know, has written on Corbusier in various journals and in an anthology written by Peter Sereny, which has been published the last couple of years. Stan referred to it yesterday. Ken wrote a very interesting article called The City of Dialectic, which was in fact a long book review, which turned into an article. It was a book review about the Radiant City. And the other things Ken has written that I'm aware of, I'm sure he's written a lot more than I'm aware of, this article in AD also called The Humanist and Utilitarian Ideals, comparing the two entries for the League of Nations projects in 1927, one by Le Corbusier and one by Hannes Meyer. Ken is now teaching at the RCA. He was recently teaching in New York, and I think needs no further description. Except to say, of course, he's speaking about the weekend house.
That's what I'm going to. I'm going to leave in a week. Yes. You don't know it exists. Yeah. I'm told to indulge in a bit of cheap publicity. This AA publication called A Continuing Experiment exists, edited by James Gowan, and actually the essence of what I have to say is in a way contained in here, or at least part of it. I think we could have some slides. Actually, these slides are somehow rather inadequate because they don't really illustrate the complete argument. They refer to just some of the evidence. And the points I wish to make about the Weekend House of 35 really spin out in a lot of directions at once. And in fact, this article in A Continuing Experiment is not called Weekend House or anything, but Reflections on the Opposition Between Architecture and Building. And I think that, for me at least, the Weekend House is evidence of a consciousness of such an opposition. Although I respect Stanley's reservations, I referred to Stanislas von Moos, about the loose use of terms in relation to cultural objects. Nevertheless, I feel that in making interpretations of Le Corbusier, or for that matter, most cultural work worthy of respect, we are correct in not underestimating the synthetic capacity and the experience of those people who make those objects. And I think it's extremely true of Le Corbusier. I think that one should never underestimate his consciousness. And I think a hard-won consciousness, as a matter of fact, which involved that mysterious period that he was supposed to have spent in the Bibliothèque Nationale while working in the atelier of Auguste Perret in Paris. A period of intense self-education, apart from the education that he received in La Chaux de Fonds. The Weekend House of 1935, which this is not an image of, this is actually, just to put you out of any kind of curiosity that you're sitting with, there is a drawing of a house for Chile, the Eresource House of 1930, which in a certain way, I think, anticipates the Weekend House of 35. The Weekend House of 35 acquires, for me anyway, its importance in the way it points to a latent problem in Le Corbusier's work, in the whole of his career, and at the same time to one of the problems which I think all of us, we all inherit. And if one looks at it historically, we have all inherited before our birth, if you wanted to speak of the collective, from the evolution of 20th century architecture. And I would say that that evolution really has to be pushed back to around 1750. I've already attempted, as I said, to treat with this theme in this publication of the A Continuing Experiment. And I have to say that I've come to look at the Weekend House of 35 and also at the Eresource House designed for Chile in 1930, 5 years before, in the light of an attempt to distinguish between architecture and building, or possibly one should say out of a recognition that such a distinction, with its affiliations to different cultural roots, has to be made. I mean, I think we have to make it. I feel compelled myself to try and make it. And I think that Corbusier was aware of it as a problem. My argument would run in this respect, I suppose, something as follows. But before I get into it, perhaps we'll just identify some of the characters. This is the Eresource elevation for Chile, obviously using Spanish tiles, not seen before in his work, pitch roofs, not seen before in his work, and when I say his work, I'm referring to the mature career that begins in 1917 with the Villa Schwab. Rubble-stone base, not seen before in his work. Next, please. And then on the interior, use of rough flagged floors, rubble-stone, lined staircase, undressed timber even. It's evident, I think, in both those images. Next. And the copy, of course, by Raymond McGrath, which was the Chile house was never built, and this is a house in Japan which McGrath copied, of course, not using stone but using timber, of which there are two images. This is a source of great deal of confusion. In fact, until recently, the AA Slide Library's version of that was labeled Eresource. Next. And next. And then the house at Marthe in France, which is of 1935, the same date as... no, sorry, this is wrong. This is 1931. It is the maison, it is the house for Hélène de Mandreau at Le Pradet near Toulon, which again uses rubble stone wall and elements drawn from vernacular construction. Next. That's the plan of it, side plan. Next. Mixture again of rubble stone wall and rendering. Next. Ideally this ought to be shown with, say, Garches under construction of 1927, which shows, concrete slabs and concrete blockwork infill, which is of course not as it looks when it's finished. So the big distinction here is that the built process, which is the point I really want to stress, of the house of Le Pradet is a part of its expression, and at Garches the built process is not expressed but rather suppressed. Next. Oh, sorry about that. The same house anyway. Next, please. You have more, I think. And then at Marthe, again, rubble stone walls. I'm sorry I put these slides together in one hell of a hurry and they're not quite right. Next, please. Again, expressed on the outside, timber construction, not exactly vernacular but conscious. Anyway, built process, including exposed beams as part of the language. Next. The same house, Marthe. Next. Same house. Next. At 35. Next. Detail of it. Next. And then this weekend house, which consists of this barrel vault construction, 35, rubble stone walling mixed with concrete frame construction, mixture of vernacular and, say, glass blocks, plate glass, sort of archetypal module sits in the garden, which, by implication from which these three progressions in terms of vaults are made. A return to a form which had appeared in 1921 in the Maison Monol, and I will return to discussing something about that at the end. Next. And the interior, again, built process, including the plywood shuttering, or the tiled floor, or the brickwork on the chimney breast, is part of the conscious expression of the house. Next. And next, if there is a next. No, that's it. Okay, so those are the main pieces of evidence as far as the actual moment in time is concerned in which the weekend house comes into existence, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now the basic argument. I think that the first part of the argument would be, for me, that architecture and building are different words with different etymological roots, finally indicating different cultural intentions. architecture, I think, running back through the inherited Western classical tradition with its sort of double threshold, first in the Renaissance, with its reinterpretations of Vitruvius, and then with Vitruvius itself in the time of Augustus. The very word architecture, in a sense, in Western inherited tradition cannot be pushed back any further, doesn't exist. And it seems to me that it's inseparable from a certain kind of historicism and instant history, that even Vitruvius, addressing Augustus, was aware of a need to create, as it were, almost an instant culture with which to celebrate the Roman Empire. And that conscious intent to kind of over-determine, if you like, the cultural status of the society is again recapitulated, of course, with very different connotations in the Renaissance. And I think that architecture then enters much later the Western Enlightenment, if one wants to date it for convenience sake, 1750, and is an inseparable part of the Western Enlightenment. It's almost the ideological bearer of the Enlightenment, I think. And I personally think that that dimension is consciously present in Corbusier's work after 1917, after the Villechroix, and is there in full force without any reservations up until 1930. I think in 1930 there is a loss of confidence, an inner loss of confidence, perhaps hardly conscious, in the mission of the Enlightenment. And one gets then houses that embrace the vernacular. Now I know what could be argued that, all right, these houses are in remote parts, they're in rustic situations, he's using local materials, he couldn't have got other kinds of materials. And therefore it's a kind of force majeure that this expression comes about. I'm not very convinced by that argument, because it's possible to render over anything, and after all, vernacular building in Greece is largely rendered over rubble work. And suddenly the rubble work is not rendered over. And the built process is expressed, and I think consciously expressed. I'm perhaps mixing this argument up slightly, because I was talking about architecture, but I veered into the central subject matter. The other side, that is building, I personally am rather convinced, and this isn't in this essay, that a continuing experiment, because it's something I've become more and more preoccupied with after that, that Martin Heidegger's arguments, which I'm not able to finally, as it were, question, about building and its etymological roots, that bauen in fact contains within it relations to the archaic form of the German verb to be, and that Bauer, farmer, is directly etymologically linked, and that one has in the word building, bauen, both being, building and cultivating at least, so that something much more organic and existential is implied by the word, and something much more rooted is implied by the word, seems to me to be the other side of the argument, and that the whole of our heritage since, well, I would say since Pugin, that is, since the beginning of the Gothic revival in this country, has been one long hassle, in a way, between whether or not the expression should be that of building, or whether or not the expression should be that of architecture. That is, whether or not our commitment is with the project of the Enlightenment. One has to remember that Corbusier has a formative period, which is pre the classical period, in La Chaux de Fonds, that his master, in fact, is totally under the influence of the English arts and crafts movement, whose dominance at that time in Europe and elsewhere was enormous, that we cannot understand anything of American modern architecture without seeing its roots in English arts and crafts movement. that in La Chaux de Fonds, Charles Le Platinier is obsessed with Owen Jones, that the Villa Jacquemet, which is his first building done at 17, is absolutely straight in the arts and crafts tradition, a native expression using the flora and fauna of the Euro region. One sees that he is already aware of the argument about building before this moment of rejecting Le Platinier and embracing the Enlightenment, which for him is the German and French Enlightenment, I think. And therefore, I think, the knowledge of Fourier and of the whole French classical tradition is deep behind him, and it does come from this basic Enlightenment source. As I've tried to argue, the year 1930 represents a moment of break in Le Corbusier's aesthetic, and I think a certain moment of hesitancy in his ideological commitment to the Enlightenment. And in fact, if purism is thought of as a highly determined rationalization of Cubism, and therefore again as part of the Enlightenment, there is, I think it's around 26, 27, the painting changes slightly. There enters these strange, what perhaps Sterling would have said then was irrational elements, objects which he called evocative of poetic emotion, which seem to anticipate 3 years later the